Fulgencio Batista was a Cuban military officer and politician who was the elected president of Cuba from 1940 to 1944 and military dictator of the country from 1952 until his overthrow in the Cuban Revolution in 1959. Batista initially rose to power as part of the 1933 Revolt of the Sergeants, which overthrew the provisional government of Carlos Manuel de Cespedes y Quesada. Batista then appointed himself chief of the armed forces, with the rank of colonel, and effectively controlled the five-member pentarchy that functioned as the collective head of state. He maintained control through a series of puppet presidents until 1940, when he was elected president on a populist platform. He then instated the 1940 Constitution of Cuba and served until 1944. After finishing his term, Batista moved to Florida, returning to Cuba to run for president in 1952. Facing certain electoral defeat, he led a military coup against President Carlos Prio Socarrás that preempted the election. Back in power and receiving financial, military, and logistical support from the United States government, Batista suspended the 1940 Constitution and revoked most political liberties, including the right to strike. He then aligned with the wealthiest landowners who owned the largest sugar plantations, and presided over a stagnating economy that widened the gap between rich and poor Cubans. Eventually, it reached the point where most of the sugar industry was in U.S. hands, and foreigners owned 70% of the arable land. As such, Batista's repressive government then began to systematically profit from the exploitation of Cuba's commercial interests, by negotiating lucrative relationships both with the American mafia, who controlled the drug, gambling, and prostitution businesses in Havana, and with large U.S.-based multinational companies who were awarded lucrative contracts. To quell the growing discontent amongst the populace, which was subsequently displayed through frequent student riots and demonstrations, Batista established tighter censorship of the media, while also utilizing his Bureau for the Repression of Communist Activities secret police to carry out wide-scale violence, torture and public executions. These murders mounted in 1957, as socialist ideas became more influential. While the exact numbers are unclear, it's believed the death toll is ranged between hundreds to up to 20,000. Batista's efforts to quell the unrest proved not only ineffective, but his tactics were the catalyst to even wider resistance against his regime. During this time, revolutionary leaders Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, founders of the July 26 movement, began a resistance campaign that saw a combination of peaceful protests and guerrilla warfare in both rural and urban areas of Cuba between 1956 and 1958. After almost 2 years of fighting, rebel forces led by Guevara successfully defeated Batista's forces at the Battle of Santa Clara on New Year's Eve, 1958, effectively collapsing the regime. On January 1, 1959, Batista announced his resignation, fleeing the country to the Dominican Republic under the protection of Rafael Trujillo, before settling in Spain, spending the rest of his life in exile until his death in 1973. Fulgencio Batista was a soldier and political leader who twice ruled Cuba, first in 1933–44 with an efficient government and again in 1952–59 as a dictator, jailing his opponents, using terrorist methods, and making fortunes for himself and his associates. The son of impoverished farmers, Batista worked in a variety of jobs until he joined the army in 1921, starting as a stenographer. He rose to the rank of sergeant and developed a large personal following. In September 1933 he organized the Sergeants' Revolt. It toppled the provisional regime of Carlos Manuel de Cespedes, which had replaced the dictatorial regime of Gerardo Machado y Morales. In the process, Batista became the most powerful man in Cuba and the country's de facto leader. An astute judge of men, Batista preferred to consolidate his control through patronage rather than terror. He cultivated the support of the army, the civil service, and organized labor. Ruling through associates the first few years, he was elected president in 1940. While greatly enriching himself, he also governed the country most effectively, expanding the educational system, sponsoring a huge program of public works, and fostering the growth of the economy. After his term ended in 1944, Batista traveled abroad and lived for a while in Florida, where he invested part of the huge sums he had acquired in Cuba. During the 8 years that he was out of power in Cuba, there was a resurgence of corruption on a grand scale, as well as a virtual breakdown of public services. His return to power, through a bloodless military coup that deposed Pres. Carlos Prio Socarrás in March 1952, was widely welcomed. But he returned as a brutal dictator, controlling the university, the press, and the Congress, and he embezzled huge sums from the soaring economy. In 1954 and 58 the country held presidential elections that, though purportedly free, were manipulated to make Batista the sole candidate. His regime was finally toppled by the rebel forces led by Fidel Castro, who launched their successful attack in the fall of 1958. Faced with the collapse of his regime and with the growing discontent of his supporters, Batista fled with his family to the Dominican Republic on January 1, 1959. Later he went into exile on the Portuguese island of Madeira and finally settled in Estoril, near Lisbon. Batista was initially educated at a public school in Baines and later attended night classes at an American Quaker school. He left home at age 14, after the death of his mother. Coming from a humble background, he earned a living as a laborer in the cane fields, docks, and railroads. He was a tailor, mechanic, charcoal vendor, and fruit peddler. In 1921, he traveled to Havana, and in April joined the army as a private. After learning shorthand and typing, Batista left the army in 1923, working briefly as a teacher of stenography before enlisting in the Guardia Rural, rural police. He transferred back to the army as a corporal, becoming secretary to a regimental colonel. In September 1933, he held the rank of sergeant stenographer and as such acted as the secretary of a group of non-commissioned officers who led a sergeant's conspiracy for better conditions and improved prospects of promotion. In 1933, Batista led an uprising called the Sergeants' Revolt, as part of the coup that overthrew the government of Gerardo Machado. Machado was succeeded by Carlos Manuel de Cespedes y Quesada, who lacked a political coalition that could sustain him and was soon replaced. A short-lived 5-member presidency, known as the Pentarchy of 1933, was established. The Pentarchy included a representative from each anti-Machado faction. Batista was not a member, but controlled Cuba's armed forces. Within days, the representative for the students and professors of the University of Havana, Ramon Grau San Martin, was made president and Batista became the army chief of staff, with the rank of colonel, effectively putting him in control of the presidency. The majority of the commissioned officer corps were forced to retire or, some speculate, were killed. Grau remained president for just over 100 days before Batista, conspiring with the U.S. envoy Sumner Welles, forced him to resign in January 1934. Grau was replaced by Carlos Mendieta, and within 5 days the U.S. recognized Cuba's new government, which lasted 11 months. Batista then became the strongman behind a succession of puppet presidents until he was elected president in 1940. After Mendieta, succeeding governments were led by José Agripino Barnett, 5 months, and Miguel Mariano Gómez, 7 months, before Federico Laredo Bru ruled from December 1936 to October 1940. Batista defeated Grau in the first presidential election, 1940, under the new Cuban constitution, and served a 4-year term as president of Cuba, the first and to this day only non-white Cuban in that office. Batista was endorsed by the Democratic Socialist Coalition and the original Cuban Communist Party, later known as the Popular Socialist Party, which at the time had little significance and no probability of an electoral victory. This support was primarily due to Batista's early advocacy of strengthening labor laws and his support for labor unions, with which the Communists had close ties, as well as the pro-Allied stance in World War II. In fact, Communists attacked the anti-Batista opposition, saying Grau and others were fascists and reactionaries. During this term in office, Batista carried out major social reforms and established numerous economic regulations and pro-union policies. Cuba entered World War II on the side of the Allies on December 9, 1941, declaring war on Japan 2 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor. On December 11, the Batista government declared war on Germany and Italy. In December 1942, after a friendly visit to Washington, Batista said Latin America would applaud if the declaration by United Nations called for war with Francisco Franco's Spain, calling the regime fascist. In 1944, Batista's hand-picked successor, Carlos Salad Rodriguez Zayas, was defeated by Grau. In the final months of his presidency, Batista sought to handicap the incoming Grau administration. In a July 17, 1944, dispatch to the U.S. Secretary of State, U.S. Ambassador Spruie Braden wrote, "It is becoming increasingly apparent that President Batista intends to discomfit the incoming administration in every way possible, particularly financially. A systematic raid on the Treasury is in full swing with the result that Dr. Grau will probably find empty coffers when he takes office on October 10. It is blatant that President Batista desires that Dr. Grau San Martin should assume obligations which in fairness and equity should be a matter of settlement by the present administration." Shortly after, Batista left Cuba for the United States. "I just felt safer there," he said. He divorced his wife, Elisa Godinez, and married Marta Fernandez in 1945. 2 of their 4 children were born in the United States. For the next 8 years, Batista remained in the background, spending time in the Waldorf Astoria in New York City and a home in Daytona Beach, Florida. He continued to participate in Cuban politics and was elected to the Cuban Senate in absentia in 1948. Returning to Cuba, he decided to run for president and received permission from President Grau, whereupon he formed the United Action Party. On taking power he founded the Progressive Action Party, but he never regained his former popular support, though the Union supported him until the end. In 1952, Batista again ran for president. In a 3-way race, Roberto Agramonte of the Orthodox Party led in all the polls, followed by Carlos Javia of the Authentic Party. Batista's United Action Coalition was running a distant third. On March 10, 1952, 3 months before the elections, Batista, with army backing, staged a coup and seized power. He ousted outgoing President Carlos Prio Socarrás, cancelled the elections and took control of the government as a provisional president. The United States recognized his government on March 27. When asked by the U.S. government to analyze Batista's Cuba, Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr. said, "The corruption of the government, the brutality of the police, the government's indifference to the needs of the people for education, medical care, housing, for social justice and economic justice, is an open invitation to revolution." Upon his seizure of power, Batista inherited a country that was relatively prosperous for Latin America. According to Batista's government, although a third of Cubans still lived in poverty, Cuba was one of the 5 most developed countries in the region. In the 1950s, Cuba's gross domestic product, GDP, per capita was roughly equal to that of Italy at the time, although still only a sixth of that of the United States. Moreover, although corruption and inequality were rife under Batista, Cuban industrial workers' wages rose significantly. In 1953, the average Cuban family only had an income of $6 a week, 15% to 20% of the labor force was chronically unemployed, and only a third of the homes had running water. Despite this, according to the International Labor Organization, the average industrial salary in Cuba became the world's 8th highest in 1958, and the average agricultural wage was higher than some European nations, although, according to one sample from 1956 to 1957, agricultural workers could only find employment for an average of 123 days per year, while farm owners, rural tenants, and sharecroppers worked an average of only 135 days per year. Throughout the 1950s, Havana served as a hedonistic playground for the world's elite, producing sizable gambling, prostitution and drug profits for the American mafia, corrupt law enforcement officials, and their politically elected cronies. In the assessment of the Cuban-American historian Luis Perez, Havana was then what Las Vegas has become. Relatedly, it is estimated that by the end of the 1950s the city of Havana had 270 brothels. In addition, drugs, be it marijuana or cocaine, were so plentiful at the time that one American magazine in 1950 proclaimed narcotics are hardly more difficult to obtain in Cuba than a shot of rum. And only slightly more expensive. As a result, the playwright Arthur Miller described Batista's Cuba in the Nation as hopelessly corrupt, a mafia playground, and a bordello for Americans and other foreigners. In a bid to profit from such an environment, Batista established lasting relationships with organized crime, notably with American mobsters Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano, and under his rule Havana became known as the Latin Las Vegas. Batista and Lansky formed a friendship and business relationship that flourished for a decade. During a stay at the Waldorf Astoria in New York in the late 1940s, it was mutually agreed that, in return for kickbacks, Batista would give Lansky and the mafia control of Havana's racetracks and casinos. After World War II, Luciano was paroled from prison on the condition that he permanently return to Sicily. Luciano secretly moved to Cuba, where he worked to resume control over American mafia operations. Luciano also ran a number of casinos in Cuba with the sanction of Batista, though the American government eventually succeeded in pressuring the Batista government to deport him. Batista encouraged large-scale gambling in Havana. In 1955, he announced that Cuba would grant a gaming license to anyone who invested $1 million in a hotel or $200,000 in a new nightclub, and that the government would provide matching public funds for construction, a 10-year tax exemption, and waive duties on imported equipment and furnishings for new hotels. Each casino would pay the government $250,000 for the license, plus a percentage of the profits. The policy omitted background checks, as required for casino operations in the United States, which opened the door for casino investors with illegally obtained funds. Cuban contractors with the right connections made windfalls by importing, duty-free, more materials than needed for new hotels and selling the surplus to others. It was rumored that, besides the $250,000 to obtain a license, an additional under-the-table fee was sometimes required. Lansky became a prominent figure in Cuba's gambling operations, and exerted influence over Batista's casino policies. The Mafia's Havana Conference was held on December 22, 1946, at the Hotel Nacional de Cuba. This was the first full-scale meeting of American underworld leaders since the Chicago meeting in 1932. Lansky set about cleaning up the games at the Montmartre Club, which soon became the place to be in Havana. He also wanted to open a casino in the Hotel Nacional, the most elegant hotel in Havana. Batista endorsed Lansky's idea over the objections of American expatriates such as Ernest Hemingway, and the renovated casino wing opened for business in 1955 with a show by Eartha Kitt. The casino was an immediate success. As the new hotels, nightclubs, and casinos opened, Batista collected his share of the profits. Nightly, the bagman for his wife collected 10% of the profits at Santo Traficante's casinos, the Sanssouci Cabaret, and the casinos in the Hotel Sevilla Biltmore, Commodora, Deauville, and Capri, partly owned by the actor George Raft. His take from the Lansky casinos, his prized Habana Riviera, the Hotel Nacional, the Montmartre Club, and others, was said to be 30%. Lansky was said to have personally contributed millions of dollars per year to Batista's Swiss bank accounts. On July 26, 1953, just over a year after Batista's second coup, a small group of revolutionaries attacked the Moncada barracks in Santiago. Government forces easily defeated the assault and jailed its leaders, while many others fled the country. The primary leader of the attack, Fidel Castro, was a young attorney who had run for parliament in the cancelled 1952 elections. Although Castro was never officially nominated, he felt that Batista's coup had sidetracked what would have been a promising political career for him. In the wake of the Moncada assault, Batista suspended constitutional guarantees and increasingly relied on police tactics in an attempt to frighten the population through open displays of brutality. Batista held an election in 1954, running as the candidate of a political coalition that included the Progressive Action Party, the Radical Union Party and the Liberal Party. The opposition divided into abstentionists and electoralists. The abstentionists favored boycotting the elections regardless of the circumstances in which they were held, whereas the electoralists sought certain rights and guarantees to participate. The CIA had predicted that Batista would use any means necessary to ensure he won the election. Batista lived up to their expectations, utilizing fraud and intimidation to secure his presidency. This led most of the other parties to boycott the elections. Former President Ramon Grau San Martin, leading the electoralist factions of the Cuban Revolutionary Party, participated through the political campaign but withdrew from the campaign days before Election Day, charging that his supporters had been terrorized. Thus Batista was elected president with the support of 45.6% of registered voters. Despite the boycott, Grau received the support of 6.8% of those who voted. The remaining voters abstained. By late 1955, student riots and anti-Batista demonstrations had become frequent, and unemployment became a problem as graduates entering the workforce could not find jobs. These were dealt with through increasing repression. All youth were seen as suspected revolutionaries. Due to its continued opposition to Batista and the large amount of revolutionary activity taking place on its campus, the University of Havana was temporarily closed on November 30, 1956. It did not reopen until 1959 under the first revolutionary government. On March 13, 1957, student leader José Antonio Echeverría was killed by police outside Radio Reloj in Havana after announcing that Batista had been killed in a student attack on the presidential palace. In reality, Batista survived, and the students of the Federation of University Students, FU, and the Directorio Revolucionario, DR, who led the attack were killed in the response by the military and police. Castro quickly condemned the attack, since July 26 movement had not participated in it. In April 1956, Batista called popular military leader Col. Ramon Barcan back to Cuba from his post as military attaché to the United States. Believing Barcan would support his rule, Batista promoted him to general. However, Barcan's Conspiration de los Puros, Conspiracy of the Pure, was already underway and had already progressed too far. On April 6, 1956, Barcan led hundreds of career officers in a coup attempt, but was frustrated by Lieutenant Rios Morajan, who betrayed the plan. Barcan was sentenced to solitary confinement for 8 years on the Isle of Pines, while some officers were sentenced to death for treason. Many others were allowed to remain in the military without reprimand. The purge of the officer corps contributed to the inability of the Cuban army to successfully combat Castro and his guerrillas. Batista's police responded to increasing popular unrest by torturing and killing young men in the cities. However, his army was ineffective against the rebels based in the Sierra Maestra and Escambray Mountains. Another possible explanation for the failure to crush the rebellion was offered by author Carlos Alberto Montaner: Batista does not finish Fidel out of greed. His is a government of thieves. To have this small guerrilla band in the mountains is to his advantage, so that he can order special defense expenditures that they can steal. Batista's rule became increasingly unpopular among the population, and the Soviet Union began to secretly support Castro. Some of Batista's generals also criticized him in later years, saying that Batista's excessive interference in his generals' military plans to defeat the rebels hampered army morale and rendered all operations ineffective. It is clear that counter-terror became the strategy of the Batista government. It has been estimated that perhaps as many as 20,000 civilians were killed. In an effort to gather information about Castro's army, Batista's secret police pulled in people for questioning. Many innocent people were tortured by Batista's police, while suspects, including youth, were publicly executed as a warning to others who were considering joining the insurgency. Additionally, hundreds of mangled bodies were left hanging from lampposts or dumped in the streets in a grotesque variation of the Spanish colonial practice of public executions. The brutal behavior backfired and increased support for the guerrillas. In 1958, 45 organizations signed an open letter supporting July 26 movement, among them national bodies representing lawyers, architects, dentists, accountants, and social workers. The United States supplied Batista with planes, ships, tanks, and the latest technology, such as napalm, which he used against the insurgency. However, in March 1958, the U.S. announced it would stop selling arms to the Cuban government. Soon after, the U.S. imposed an arms embargo, further weakening the government's position, although landowners and others who benefited from the government continued to support Batista. Elections were scheduled for June 1958, as required by the Constitution, but were delayed until November 1958, when Castro and the revolutionaries called for a general strike and placed several bombs in civilian areas of the country. Three main candidates ran in the elections: Carlos Marquez Sterling of the Party of the Free People, former President Ramón Grau San Martín of the Cuban Revolutionary Party Authentic, and Andrés Rivero Agüero of the government coalition. According to Carlos Marquez Sterling, all three were threatened by Castro, and several assassination attempts were made on both Ramón Grau San Martín and Carlos Marquez Sterling. On election day, estimates on the turnout range from 30 to 50% in the areas where voting took place, which did not include parts of Las Villas and Orient, which were controlled by Castro. Marquez Sterling also stated that the initial results were favorable to him, but the military ordered the counting to stop as they changed the actual ballots for fraudulent ones. However, Grau San Martín, as he had previously done in the 1954 elections, withdrew his candidacy within a few hours of the election day. Batista declared Rivero Agüero the winner. The U.S. rejected the results of the elections and announced plans to withhold diplomatic recognition of the Rivero Agüero government. The American ambassador to Cuba, Earl Smith, informed Agüero that the United States would not give aid and support to his government. Smith also informed Batista that the U.S. believed him incapable of maintaining effective control and that he should retire. On December 31, 1958, at a New Year's Eve party, Batista told his cabinet and top officials that he was leaving the country and resigned. After 7 years, Batista knew his presidency was over, and he fled the island in the early morning. At 3 a.m. on January 1, 1959, Batista boarded a plane at Camp Colombia with 40 of his supporters and immediate family members and flew to Ciudad Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. A second plane flew out of Havana later in the night, carrying ministers, officers, and the governor of Havana. Batista took along a personal fortune of more than $300 million that he had amassed through graft and payoffs. Critics accused Batista and his supporters of taking as much as $700 million in fine art and cash with them as they fled into exile. As news of the fall of Batista's government spread through Havana, the New York Times described jubilant crowds pouring into the streets and automobile horns honking. The black and red flag of the July 26 movement waved on cars and buildings. The atmosphere was chaotic. On January 8, 1959, Castro and his army rolled victoriously into Havana. Already denied entry to the United States, Batista sought asylum in Mexico, which also refused him. Portugal's leader Antonio Salazar allowed him to settle there on the condition that he completely abstain from politics. Historians and primary documents estimate between hundreds and 20,000 Cubans were killed under the Batista regime. However, the 20,000 number is disputed by several historians, which considered it as propaganda. According to French historian Janine Verdes-Leroux, Batista married Elisa Godinez y Gómez on July 10, 1926. They had 3 children: Mirta Caridad, 1927 to 2010, Elisa Oleta, born 1933, and Fulgencio Ruben Batista Godinez, 1933 to 2007. By all accounts, she was devoted to him and their children throughout their marriage, and their daughter remembered them as a happy, young couple until their sudden divorce. Much to her surprise, he divorced her in October 1945 against her will in order to marry his longtime mistress Marta Fernandez Miranda. He married Fernandez on November 28, 1945, shortly after his divorce became final, and they had 5 children: Jorge Luis, born 1942, Roberto Francisco, born 1947, Carlos Manuel, 1950 to 1969, Fulgencio Jose, born 1953, and Marta Maria Batista Fernandez, born 1957. After fleeing, Batista had a child born shortly after his death named Mateo C. Batista. His mother removed the Batista from his name as to avoid suspicion. Batista was an inveterate philanderer who engaged in numerous extramarital affairs throughout his first marriage. He cheated on his first wife with multiple women, and his children eventually became aware of his relationships. His first wife, who supported her husband throughout his political career and found his philandering humiliating, never considered divorce and tolerated his multiple affairs. However, Batista became enamored with the much younger Marta Fernandez Miranda, who became his longtime mistress. He filed divorce papers shortly before his first grandchild was born. His first wife and their children were astounded and devastated by the divorce. In 1935, he fathered an illegitimate daughter, Fermina Lazara Batista Estevez, whom he supported financially. After he fled to Portugal, Batista lived in Madeira, then later in Estoril. He died of a heart attack on August 6, 1973, in Marbella, Spain. Marta Fernandez Miranda de Batista, Batista's widow, died on October 2, 2006. Roberto Batista, her son, said that she died at her home in West Palm Beach, Florida, U.S. She had suffered from Alzheimer's disease. Thank you for watching this video.